Hello and welcome to the Bulletin with UBS on Monocle Radio. Each week, the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in finance take you beyond the numbers and hype, right to the heart of the big issues of the day. This week, with the Biodiversity COP having just wrapped in Cali, Colombia, the time is right to discuss both the event and the theme of biodiversity more generally. In particular, to consider why nature and nature-based finance can and should matter so much for financial institutions. With both the lead for advocacy and nature in the Chief Sustainability Office in UBS and the Global Head of Sustainable and Impact Investing for the UBS CIO on the show, we'll hear about everything from recent milestones in the space to the fast-developing regulatory environment to the kinds of thematic and investment innovations that are delivering solutions for smart investors' portfolios. First up, we welcome back to the programme Judson Berkey, Lead for Advocacy and Nature in the Chief Sustainability Office in UBS. Judson, welcome to the show. Now, we're talking about the just-wrapped Biodiversity COP, but maybe before we do that, can you tell us why these broader themes, nature and biodiversity, why they matter more generally for institutions like UBS?
There's been a lot of research done over the past years to try and tease out the relationship between nature and broader economy. So there's been any number of analyses done, roughly all coming in the same conclusions. Plus minus 50% of GDP can be tied back to some sort of material dependency to nature. So essentially our economies as we know them, the food we eat, the clothes we wear, the pharmaceuticals that keep us healthy, all these things are derived from what are called ecosystem services. So those are the benefits provided to us by nature. So understanding that dependency and realizing at the same time that nature is under pressure. The publication came out just recently. It's from WWF. Every 2 years, they do something called the Living Planet Report. And they've been documenting over the period of past 50 years, how nature has been under pressure and essentially degrading. And so they have a headline figure, 73% of the species that they have been tracking for those 50 years, their populations have decreased by 73%. So that gives you a sense of essentially what has been happening. While we've been deriving lots of benefits for our societies from nature, we've been putting intense pressure on nature. You can think about deforestation, you can think about pollution in various forms. So essentially what's going on here, and we're coming to a point, as we have with climate, where it's a fundamental realization that there is a need for a re-engineering of how our economies work and a lot of the goods and services we produce and their reliance on nature and some of the negative impacts we're having on nature. So this COP that you mentioned, this Biodiversity Conference, it's derived from something called the Convention on Biological Diversity. That was an agreement amongst governments back in 1992. At the same time, they signed the climate change agreement, as well as a third agreement on desertification of land. But essentially, it's an agreement where governments are trying to progress on this issue. They're trying to essentially, amongst themselves, identify and agree how they can reduce some of these pressures on nature, help restore and conserve land and seas and our natural ecosystems. And so they get together every 2 years in this thing called the COP. Some of your listeners may know the climate COPs that happen every year. The biodiversity or the nature equivalent happens every 2 years. And so they get together and they try and discuss where they go next. But this COP in particular is significant in that it comes 2 years later from the last one, where they actually agreed a very formal framework for the next years ahead. So something called the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. You can think of it as the Paris Agreement for nature, essentially. And it's a statement of the objectives or the goals that countries have signed up to now to essentially conserve and restore nature. So they talk about trying to get to some version of what they call nature positive. That language isn't actually in the agreement itself, but it's essentially trying to get back to a more neutral point of our natural ecosystems and even try and improve beyond that. So again, the equivalent in the climate world is kind of like this net zero word or a phrase that people may know. And so essentially we're trying to work towards some similar shared objective around nature and biodiversity.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I was going to ask you about the framework, because often it seems that sometimes agreeing on, with some of the discourse around the climate change debate, just agreeing the targets can be tricky, agreeing the metrics. And you talk about this re-engineering. I guess one of the starting points, and maybe this is why that framework is such a compelling development, is because it provides that structure, right? I mean, was that a problem when you first were really digging into this space to see that there was a lack of coherence, maybe even about the kinds of metrics and the kinds of structures that were in place to gauge progress? I mean, that was a problem. Are things getting better at a suitably rapid pace in that respect, Judson?
Nature is inherently a little bit more complicated than climate for a couple of reasons. One, it's not a single topic, it's a bundle of topics. The scientific framing around nature talks about 5 drivers of nature loss, including things like land use change and resource use or overconsumption on resources. Climate change itself is a driver of nature loss, and pollution and what are called invasive species, or foreign populations being introduced into new territories. So those are sort of 5 drivers of nature loss. So that right there tells you, okay, there's multiple things to think about, right? It's not just about the CO2 equivalent emissions. And in the climate world, there's carbon, there's methane, but basically it all can be summed or aggregated up into your CO2 equivalents. And so you have this singular unit you're trying to track. The other complexity with nature is it's location specific, right? It really matters what you do and where you do it and how you do it. The classical example people can give is a much different result if you create a parking lot in a desert versus the rainforest. And so grappling with that location specificity is also a challenge on nature. So that means basically you're dealing with more complexity and more things you need to measure, and you need to measure it in a more location-based way, because again, the analog with climate, a ton of CO2 out of the atmosphere, no matter where it happens, is good. And so you have that fungibility across locations, whereas you don't necessarily have that with nature. So that makes it all more challenging to think about, okay, how do you measure? What are you trying to sort of set up as an objective? And back to that agreement, this global biodiversity framework, what they've done in there is try to lay out any number of topics or focal points on which to make progress. Since they do talk about something called a 30 by 30 target. So trying to restore and then set aside 30% of land and seas. So essentially reducing very much the impacts of our economic activity on 30% basically of the earth. We're much below that at present. They also talk about reducing things like pesticides, reducing plastic pollutions and other things. So there's a whole bundle of topics within this global biodiversity framework. Also, there are key measures within it about trying to reduce negative subsidies, to increase the funding for nature from governments and the private sector. Some of the same things they obviously have in the Paris Agreement too. But to your question, it's a little bit more complicated, and there are a number of different things that need to get measured. And certainly, there's a lot of energy going into figuring out how to collect data, how to turn that into intelligence, because there actually is a lot of data available. Scientists and governmental agencies and other conservation groups have been doing very admirable jobs collecting data on the state of nature all around. But what's often challenged for the private sector is turning that raw data into intelligence that's actionable for companies and for financial institutions. So long story short, there's a lot of work to do, but an incredible amount of energy going into trying to figure out how to make this quite actionable, because one of the main targets set by this global biodiversity framework was actually halting and reversing nature loss by 2030. So we're now close to the end of 2024. So there's this notion that we actually need to essentially get to a point where we're no longer losing more nature against a 2020 baseline by 2030 in just 5 years' time. So really a lot of energy going into rapidly accelerating progress here, and a lot of learnings to come from the climate work as well. And I think that's really helping the nature topic progress very, very rapidly.
What role will blended finance play here, Judson? Is that one of the key levers or key approaches to driving progress?
Yeah, certainly one of the approaches that will be very helpful to progressing here, because part of the challenge with nature is it's often been treated as an unpriced free good. And so it just doesn't necessarily have sort of the economic returns attached to it that make it attractive for sort of market rate investments and instruments. So having some sort of kind of solution where there can be different forms of capital brought to support, say an ecosystem restoration, or say restoration of mangroves, for example, which even can have climate benefits as well as broader nature benefits. You're finding ways to bring different kinds of capital to bear to support activities. I think will be critical. So blended finance programs and instruments and structures will be critical to that. And that can be in a very nice way for public money and private money also to come together and really support some needed activity.
And just finally, I wanted to just touch briefly on the regulatory questions in this space. Judson, I know you mentioned them in passing earlier, but how thorny and complex an issue is that? Because you've got so many different stakeholders, you've got so many different geographies and demographies are involved. Are you confident? And I don't know, even, we get the whisperings from out of COP in terms of the cohesion of that discourse and actually a unanimity emerging of the kinds of regulatory requirements that we need to affect change at the required pace. Where are we in that journey? And are you reassured by some of the things you hear?
I mean, one always hopes for things to move quickly and when you're a global firm like a UBS, for things to be quite consistent across the globe. Now, I think we're realistic about how that usually evolves. And so when it comes to particularly financial regulation, countries have different interest points and move at different speeds. And when it comes to broader regulation of the non-financial sector and a lot of our clients, obviously that also can work differently. We've seen certain jurisdictions, for example, Europe, come out with things like the deforestation regulation, and that's obviously proven to be a little bit more complicated than everyone hoped. And so now it may get pushed out a year, but ultimately it does sort of start to put in place, frameworks and structures and incentives for key industries really to start to think about their supply chains and how they restructure them. We at UBS have been very pleased to be part of something called the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, the TNFD. That was essentially a market-based initiative set up like the TCFD for climate, and we were part of that one as well. And we saw that as a very effective way to try and catalyze activity in the private sector, essentially ahead of regulations. As a large investor, essentially we are invested across the whole of the economy. We want to make sure that the companies we're investing in are thinking through the impacts that they have in the natural world, the dependencies they have on natural capital, how they're managing the risks and opportunities that result from that. So something like the TNFD as a market-based standard can essentially be quite helpful in that way, because it sort of gets companies globally starting to think through in a consistent way how they approach a topic like nature. And so we were pleased to be part of that effort and to hear the recommendations came out last year. A number of companies, including ourselves, have signed up as so-called early adopters, and we'll start putting out TNFD-aligned disclosures. We do see that as a market framework, so I don't necessarily think that the TNFD should immediately turn into regulation in that form, that there should be regulatory processes that work through and take on board the nature topic, hopefully looking to things like TNFD for inspiration and some of the concepts. So in that sense, we're very supportive also of what's been done at the international level, the so-called International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSB, which essentially now is really driving out a somewhat consistent disclosure framework for corporates across the globe. Obviously, there's a large European standard that a lot of companies comply with, but for everyone else, if there can be a global standard, that is also quite helpful to really get essentially consistent information into the market, a consistent way of thinking about a topic, some consistency and disclosures across companies. At the end of the day, you can only disclose what you are actually doing inside a firm. And so disclosure has an additional benefit that does drive backwards into a firm in terms of thinking through its core internal management and risk processes. So anything that can be a catalyst for improving that is certainly useful.
Judson Berkey. Well, next up, it's a pleasure to welcome back to the programme Andrew Lee, Global Head of Sustainable and Impact Investing for UBS Global Wealth Management's Chief Investment Office. Andrew, great to have you with us once again. Before we get into the investing picture of biodiversity, Andrew, and I guess at the risk of rather asking you to state what perhaps is or should be obvious, just remind us why nature and biodiversity is such a compelling topic for you, I guess, personally and professionally at UBS.
Look, I think as individuals, but also as investors, and then obviously for us as a financial institution, it's clear that just like climate, nature and biodiversity have significant impact on everything, life, the economy more broadly, and the globe. And so when we think about these significant topics, it's important to us both as individuals, but also as investors to think about it. So for us as a financial institution, thinking about why natural capital is critically important is something that we need to consider. And it's not something that as a topic is necessarily intuitive for most of us to think about, especially in the context of investments. But I think, nature is essential to the global economy. More than half of global GDP is generated through economic activities that are related to nature. But I think it's important because it is so nascent in terms of understanding still. I think there are many people who have long recognized the importance of nature for the overall economy, for investments. But I think for the vast majority of people, it is still relatively early stage in terms of the thinking, the understanding of how to incorporate it, what the standards are in terms of approaching it in consistent and comparable ways, and really the set of solutions that's available to all of us in order to do so more broadly.
Yeah, well, let's look at that then, because I guess against that backdrop, the nature and content and learnings of the research that's conducted becomes ever more important. Just give us a little bit of a sense about some of the prisms through which you and your colleagues in UBS, Andrew, look at these topics. Through that research lens, we can talk about things like circularity, the blue economy, all these different things. What are some of the sort of research prisms that enable you to start to gather all of that critical data that we need to then start making better decisions?
Sure. I mean, look, I think maybe the first place to start is when we think about the investment perspective. Investors might have different motivations for investing in nature, right? Whether that's thinking about how to manage the attendant risks from nature and biodiversity, thinking about the opportunities that are available, or for some investors actually thinking about driving change and the change that's needed in order to avoid the depletion of these natural resources, whether we're talking about oceans or biodiversity or water. And so, I think that there are different types of approaches, right, that investors can use to think about these things. And I think generally speaking, we think about it as, are you investing for nature? Are you investing in nature, right? And I think when we talk about investing for nature, it can take a number of different lenses, right? It's, in one instance, thinking about considering the risks of nature, right? And how to incorporate that into a typical investment process, looking at individual instruments, individual companies, and how to think about companies that are perhaps less harmful from an overall nature and biodiversity standpoint. And so, is the data available in order to support investors in doing so? That's one of the things that needs to be improved. TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, and greater commitments to that will help increase disclosure and support investors in thinking about what are some of those risks and incorporating that into an investment process, just as they would with topics like climate, for example. So I think that's one lens. Another lens would be thematic investments, right, that target biodiversity loss drivers across a range of different things. You mentioned circularity, right? So circular economy is one of the themes that's interesting. How can you target companies that are focused on pollution, waste, and land use? Another topic beyond circularity might be agricultural yield in food, right? How do you target land use, crop resilience, resource management, and other important topics when thinking about the food production system that we have across the globe? The blue economy and oceans, right? How do we focus on targeting pollution and waste as issues? And in particular, how to focus on driving change there. And then maybe one last one to mention might be water scarcity and thinking about the resource efficiency of water. So I think the thematic lens is maybe another one to think about beyond the risk side. And maybe one last one to think about is just across asset classes, right? So oftentimes when we think about investing into, we think about the themes and inequities in particular. But, investors have, across diversified portfolios, have exposure to fixed income. So there are a range of fixed income instruments that also work towards the same end objectives that we just talked about, right? So green bonds and the use of proceeds for those instruments that can help target some of the challenges related to biodiversity loss, in areas like water management or waste management, again, pollution control, a lot of these same themes coming up again and again, right? Blue bonds that are specifically focused on water and oceans and supply management, wastewater treatment in those areas. some of the linked bonds that are out there that are focused on nature-based solutions. And some of the more interesting and innovative instruments out there, like debt for nature swaps, which have seen an exponential growth in focus and really address issues in developing countries in particular. So a lot of interesting areas across investor portfolios to think about, but I think the thematic lens might be one of the more interesting ones, and just remembering that you can have exposure to or drive nature transition across a range of different asset classes and exposures in a diversified portfolio.
Are you satisfied that we're seeing the product innovation happening at the requisite pace? We know that the challenge is so urgent and it's so vast in scope. Are you reassured, whether that's looking at the conversations that come out of Biodiversity COP or the conversations you have with other key stakeholders within and without the bank, that we're seeing innovation on the product side happening at the same required pace?
As I mentioned, I think it's still earlier days with regard to nature and biodiversity. I think if we think about the trajectory that climate and climate solutions have followed, I think there's still a lot more to be developed on the climate side. And I think that remains the case with nature and nature-focused types of solutions, especially when we think about solutions that are pure play or specifically focused on nature as opposed to that as one of the attendant objectives or topical areas. So I think we're early. I think that there's a lot more development to do across asset classes, whether those are in the equity space or new types of fixed income instruments, or even thinking about some of the instruments that are there to address some of the challenges that may not be solvable through market rate types of instruments, right? So thinking about the use of blended finance and the role that blended finance can play in encouraging more market rate capital at scale into the space, whether the blended finance structures are innovated or funded by governments or development finance institutions or even philanthropic sources. I think this is another source of interesting product innovation that can really help drive more capital towards nature. So the answer to your question, Thomas, we're still early and there's a lot more opportunity, but the opportunity side of things is what I think will help catalyze more focus, especially as more and more investors continue to recognize the relevance of nature to our overall economy and to the investment space.
Yeah, can I just ask you one thing, Andrew, briefly about the actual mechanics then of how, looking at portfolio management, how smart investors who care about these issues look to then make their decisions. We talked a little bit about circularity. Is part of it to say, well, look, you need to be minded and identify, companies who are embracing circularity in an identifiable way. They could stand to benefit. This is something that should get your attention. Or if we look at, say, blue economy, is it more about saying, well, look, this is going to be driven by, new, say, regulatory frameworks. So we need to be across understanding those frameworks and where the envelope is being pushed so that we can identify opportunities. What are the actual mechanics of taking the abstract theory here and then actually implementing that into your portfolio strategy?
It's a great question. I think it really comes back to investors looking at what are the risks out there, what are the opportunities to capitalize on, and what's the economy or the world going to look like down the line? Because as investors, we are focused on investing for the world that we will live in and making sure that our investments are fit for purpose and all of the exposures in them are fit for purpose, on a long-term basis. And yes, we will make tactical adjustments to those, but we are all focused on long-term investments. And so thinking about where the opportunities are and if the opportunities are in fact related to sustainability broadly or climate and nature specifically, that's how you want to craft your investment exposure. So, blue economy is a great example. Thinking about if in fact there is a significant opportunity and the size of what we call the blue economy or investments that relate to ocean and water in some way, if that is $1 trillion opportunity or if it's a $3 trillion opportunity, that's something that you want to bake in terms of exposure to, whether that's on the equity side or the fixed income side or even on the alternative side. And so thinking about it through a risk and opportunity lens, I think, is always the way that investors think about things. And the recognition that whether it's circularity, whether it's the blue economy, those do represent significant investable opportunities that do provide risk-adjusted returns is really the motivator that will drive more specific exposure, more target exposure into these areas.
Andrew, I just wanted to ask you finally, it always strikes me when I talk to you and your colleagues throughout UBS, you seem to wear the responsibility in this space very, very lightly, despite it can be a heavy burden. This idea of freeing up capital at the scale and pace required to drive change. We're talking about nature-based financial solutions, but we often, and historically, have looked more to the public sector to lead. The private sector's doing it. Private finance is driving. What's your view on that? I guess it's transformational, right? And I guess critically as well, your clients want to be involved in that conversation.
You're right, Tom. It is transformational. I think you've characterized it exactly right, which is historically the vast majority of the funding for nature-based solutions and nature finance has really come from governments and public sources rather than private capital. And so as we think about the opportunities ahead and private investors wanting to be positioned for the opportunities ahead, as well as thinking about the risks in their portfolio and how they can get, solutions in there to reflect that, I think that is the opportunity is to mobilize more capital from private investors to complement what has come thus far from governments and public sources. And we know that a significant amount of capital will be needed in order to address nature and biodiversity risks and issues. And so this mobilization of private investor capital, where it's historically been something on the order of 20% or less of overall nature finance funding, if that can flip or increase significantly, I think that will help to address many of these challenges and allow private investors to capitalize on or benefit from that in their investment portfolios. So really a dual purpose, but more, I think, to come from the private capital space.
Andrew Lee, and before that, Judson Berkey, bringing us to the end of this edition of The Bulletin with UBS on Monocle Radio. You can listen again and explore more at monocle.com or follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to discover more and find out how UBS can help you at ubs.com. This is The Bulletin with UBS on Monocle Radio. I'm Tom Edwards. Thanks for listening.